Here, this is a quote from David Pakman. Basically, everyone who has a shot at this thing in the Democratic primary will listen to the generals if they were president. And he says, this whole thing was a quote. He says, I don't think that's a bad thing. What? If you think the dynamic between Bernie Sanders and the generals in the national security apparatus is that he's going to come into the White House and he's going to just take their advice, their sage advice, because they're wise, experienced leaders, rather than there being an adversarial dynamic between Bernie Sanders and their national security apparatus, you just don't know Bernie Sanders and you don't know U.S. foreign policy. That's just what it is. How can you say Bernie Sanders, of all people, of all politicians in the country, is going to just blindly follow the advice of these warmongers? That is crazy. Bernie Sanders, his entire life, his entire career, has been a part of the anti-war, anti-interventionist movement. And for the most part, his record of being anti-interventionist and anti-imperialist has been consistent for the 40 years he's been in elected office. One of the only people to oppose the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. Out of the House and the Senate, Bernie Sanders was one of the only politicians, you could count on both hands the amount of politicians who stood up against those wars. Bernie Sanders was leading the charge in the anti-war, anti-interventionist movement back during the invasion of Iraq. He predicted the fucking debacle and boondoggle and quagmire that this whole thing, this war on terror, would become. He predicted the mass civilian casualties, the instability in the Middle East, the refugee crisis, instability in governments collapsing, the rise of terrorist groups, jihadist groups throughout the Middle East. He predicted all of that, and he was vociferous and unbowed, unrepentant in his anti-war advocacy back in the early 2000s. And Bernie Sanders has not let up ever since then. Bernie Sanders is one of the only ones to talk about the insane amount of civilian casualties going on in all these wars that we're fighting in the Middle East. He's one of the only ones to come out and take a principled stand against our outlandish military budget that we use to fund endless wars around the world. Bernie Sanders, he is so out front on this anti-war movement. He was, when all the other politicians in Washington were looking the other way and ignoring this genocide that we're participating in Yemen, worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, Bernie Sanders, in a Republican-led Senate with a Republican majority leader, forced a vote on the War Powers Act to get us out, to end, for the first time in U.S. history, to end U.S. involvement in an illegal war. Bernie Sanders got that through the House and through a Republican Senate. That is extraordinary. So again, I say this because Bernie Sanders is firmly on the anti-war, anti-interventionist side of U.S. foreign policy. Where are the generals? The generals, for his entire career, every step of the way, have fought Bernie Sanders. They fought to stay in these wars. They fought to start these illegal, unauthorized, endless wars. And they defended it every step of the way. So when Bernie Sanders says, we need to cut the military budget, the generals come out and say, we shouldn't cut the military budget. When the generals are saying, we should go into Iraq and illegally overthrow the government and start all this fucking chaos in the Middle East, Bernie Sanders said we shouldn't do it. When Bernie Sanders came out and said we need to end U.S. involvement in Yemen because this is illegal, this is a genocide, and we're participating in the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet, the generals still to this day are saying we should stay in Yemen. So and David Pakman has been so disingenuous. I've seen him be so disingenuous over the years. I don't even know if he believes this, but do you really believe Bernie Sanders, of all politicians, will come in and he's going to just continue the status quo? Generals are going to advise Bernie Sanders, hey, maybe we should get out of Iraq, maybe we should get out of Afghanistan, maybe we should get out of Syria, because none of them have done that up to this point. If you think that the relationship between Bernie Sanders and the national security apparatus, the Pentagon, is going to be more cooperative than adversarial, you don't know Bernie Sanders, you don't know foreign policy. Now I want to get to David saying that listening to the generals quote, isn't a bad thing. If you believe that the generals are just objectively looking at each and every scenario and providing sober, rational analysis when they give their recommendations on military engagements, you're incredibly naive and childish. If David actually believes that, then it just shows he hasn't thought about this critically. Because if you believe that, you would have to literally disregard all the evidence that we've learned over the last however many decades or since the founding of the United States that proves otherwise. All the evidence that points to the fact that they're not, these generals, these people in the Pentagon, they're part of the military industrial complex, and they're not making decisions based off of what's best for the national security of the United States. They're making decisions for what's best for the military industrial complex. What did we learn besides in the Pentagon papers that were released by Daniel Ellsberg? What did we learn besides the fact that these same generals and commanders are war criminals and they were ordering war crimes and massacring civilians, poisoning water, indiscriminately bombing people? We learned that, yeah. But we also learned that throughout the entire Pentagon, there was a consensus that they were going to lie to the American people. They were going to lie about what was actually happening in Vietnam. They were just going to completely not mention Laos and Cambodia. They were going to do all of that because, and it was explicit in the Nixon administration, what we learned from the Pentagon papers, they were doing that explicitly because they thought if the American people saw what was happening, if they knew what was happening in Vietnam, they would call for an end to the war and it would be unanimous. So the generals, the Pentagon, and all these different administrations that were around during the Vietnam War, they all decided, let's lie to the American people so that we can stay in war longer, so we can serve our own interest. Even if we have to massacre civilians, even if it's not in the interest of national security for the United States, we're going to lie because it benefits us personally. And we won't look bad, and we all get promotions and all that stuff. And ever since then, not a goddamn thing has changed. That is the same culture in the military. In the documentary, I was watching a documentary about the Iraq War. I think it was, I can't remember the name off the top of my head. But there was a part of the documentary where they explained how it wasn't like, where they explained why the consensus to war is, or to stay in war, to start war within the Pentagon isn't an accident. They went on it to explain how it's just a revolving door between the Pentagon and the military industrial complex and defense contractors. You have these people who start their career in the military, they get promoted and they're officers and they're in leadership in the military, and already you get to those positions by continuing the status quo and not pushing back against the status quo, so that already tells you something about their character. But more than that, after they get out, a huge percentage of the people who are lobbyists for the military industrial complex or who are on the boards of these defense contractors, a lot of them, or people who are national security experts in mainstream media, a lot of these people were in the military. So they made their careers off of war, got all promotions and all the name recognition and all of that. Then after they get out, their career is dependent on, and them making millions of dollars is dependent on us staying in war, and all of their friends who haven't yet left the military are in agreement that we should all stay in war. So it's basically a whole racket, and no matter what the question is, the answer is always going to be, let's do more war, let's stay in wars longer, because it benefits them personally. And if David Pakman doesn't see that, I don't know what to say. Like I mentioned earlier, the generals that are in power right now, the people in the military in power right now, they got us into Iraq. They've lied about Iraq ever since it started. They defended the over 1 million civilians dead, and always, it's same with Afghanistan, they will always come up with some justification as to why we cannot leave. the longest wars in U.S. history, and if you ask any of these goddamn generals, they will still tell you we should not leave because something Taliban, something about the Al-Qaeda, something about ISIS. They always have some rationalization for why we can't end the wars. And David he always acts like just because he's from Latin America, he's from Argentina, that, oh man, trust me, man, I know about U.S. imperialism. I know better than anyone else. I was living in a region that was affected by U.S. imperialism. He always likes to pull that card, but still, from this and all his other all the other things I've heard on him for foreign policy, he has absolutely no clue about like what's really going on with U.S. foreign policy. And to that point, David, he's even just dead wrong about Latin American U.S. foreign policy when it comes to Latin America. He was over there. One of the only people on the left coming out and saying, back when the Trump administration was, and they still are, full bore, trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government in broad daylight just so it can steal the oil. John Bolton all but said it multiple times. So has Mike Pence and Donald Trump and Mike Pompeo, that we're going over there to steal the oil. We're going to do regime change, topple the government so we can steal the oil. David Pakman would still come out and say, if you think, anybody on the left who thinks the U.S. is actively doing a coup in Venezuela to steal the oil, that's a conspiracy theory. David literally said that. This coup in Bolivia, David still doing State Department CIA talking points. Oh yeah, Evo Morales, he was such a bad guy, man. He rigged that election. Do I have any proof? Fuck no. But somebody said, at the CIA said that he, in the OAS, they said Evo Morales is a bad guy, so, you know, of course he's a bad guy. And I'm from Latin America. I'm from Argentina, so I know. Well, David, if you think that, if you are so informed on what the U.S. involvement in Latin America really was, if you're so informed on that, there's no way in hell you would believe anything the generals say when it comes to war, because they were lying. They all were on board with the coups and the regime change and the supporting military juntas and dictators and human rights violators and war criminals massacring civilians. They were all on board with it because it served U.S. interests. So David, so let me get to my point. At every turn, under every rock, after analyzing every piece of information we have learned about how the military operates, how the Pentagon operates, and their incentives, if you still think that there isn't an explicit, systemic, pro-war bias in the leadership of the military, and you still think that we should go to those very same warmongers and war criminals and ask them for advice about ending wars, or when we should end wars, I can't explain how stupid that is. I can't explain how counterproductive that is. And then he brings up this very, stupid point. I don't know how else to explain it. He says, and you know, I talk to people on the show who call in and say they're worried that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, they're going to weaken the military or whatever. They're not going to defend the country. First of all, anybody who believes that is stupid. Or to believe, that is a stupid thing to believe. Let me just put it that way. And I mean stupid, not ignorant, because it isn't a lack of knowledge that would lead you to believe that. You genuinely, that is just a stupid thing to believe. Name a single politician or world leader anywhere who is going around and is like running on making the country weaker, and if anything were to happen, if there was an actual threat to the country, or if we were attacked, they would just be like, oh shit, that was bad, huh? And not do anything. Like, if you believe that Bernie Sanders is gonna do that, that's just a stupid thing to believe, because he has never said anything like that. And just common sense dictates nobody believes that. Why would anybody think, if the country's under threat, if the country's been attacked, I'm just gonna not do anything about that? That's a stupid thing to believe. So the point is stupid, and I know people do call into the show and say that. I'm sure they do. I've heard it before, but still, it's a stupid point, and it's even sillier for David to bring it up to me, because like, what are you trying to say? Like, to me, now this is just speculation. To me, it came across when I saw him when he says that. It's like like what I was saying earlier about how he's careful about what he tells his audience. He only wants his audience to know specific things so he can shape their opinions about certain things. So he's very manipulative with his audience. And I feel like that's the point that he was like that. I feel like that's what he was trying to do when he brought up the people. Like, oh, you say we should take on the national security apparatus, and there's some people who call into my show and they're worried that Bernie Sanders isn't going to do anything if we're attacked. I feel like when he's bringing that up, what he's doing is trying to pander to his audience and be, hey, look, man, I'm not a radical who's gonna, lambast the national security apparatus and the generals. Oh, no, that's not me. Bernie Sanders is gonna, you shouldn't worry. Bernie Sanders is gonna be strong and he's gonna protect us if anything happens. Like, no, how about you actually push back against that and defend the actual anti-interventionist position, which is, first of all, if you think Bernie Sanders is going to let us be attacked, or if we get attacked, he's not going to do anything, you're stupid. Second of all, Bernie Sanders is right to be critical of the generals because all they do is get us into war and commit war crimes and make us stay in the wars, endless wars. So yeah, Bernie Sanders is right to criticize him. That's the actual non-interventionist position to take and to defend. So it's weird that Bernie Sanders is it's weird that David Pakman is trying to pander to his audience and, oh man, no, you don't have anything to worry about. Bernie Sanders is going to keep us safe. Like, I just think that's silly. And then the point he makes after that, I feel like that was like a shot at me because I called into his show and I basically blasted the national security apparatus. I blasted the generals and Elizabeth Warren on her foreign policy. So he makes this point that Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Elizabeth Warren, they will all listen to the generals because unlike Donald Trump, they know that they're not experts on everything. So this is an exact quote from David. When it comes to when and where we should use our military, I think they will all listen to the generals. Whoa there. I'm gonna need you to slow it down there, Pakman. Again, this is another one of those tricks that he likes to use to like manipulate the audience. He, instead of dealing with the actual position that I'm advocating or the position that I'm arguing, he wants to straw man it and be like, or simplify it and act like either you listen to people with experience or you're Donald Trump and you think you know everything. Like I feel like that's what he was trying to, like that's the dig that he was trying to make, the jab that he was trying to make. And it's like, he knows his audience is nothing but a cult of Trump deranged people. So if you frame it like that, of course they're all gonna be like, I don't want to be like Donald Trump. Of course I'm gonna listen to the generals. I don't think I know everything. I'm not Donald Trump. So I feel like that's like he was trying to get off on the audience like that too. And let me just make this point. So again, right there in that framing, he's basically admitting, yeah, I think the generals, I think they're all experts. I think they all know what they're doing, and I think we should all listen to them when it comes to when and how we should use our military. Just the fact that you're a general, just because you have rank, just because you have spent your entire career in the military, that does not mean you know more about U.S. foreign policy than anybody else. And this comes to a real fundamental, that it shows that David has a lack of understanding of basically our form of government. He thinks the military knows best, they know all, and we should just defer to them when it comes to when and how to use the military. Ignoring the fact that in the Constitution, we have a civilian-controlled military, a civilian-led military. There's supposed to be a civilian in charge of the Department of Defense. Donald Trump broke precedent by having James Mattis, a general, serve as the Secretary of Defense. That isn't a normal thing that's supposed to happen. Civilians are supposed to lead the military. Congress has oversight of the military. They are civilians. And the president, who is also a civilian, has oversight and direct authority and direct control over the military. We have a civilian-controlled military for a reason. All they want to do is stay in war because that benefits them. If we were to completely defer to them, we would always be in war. We would always be trying to start war because that's what they want. And that's not in the best interest of the United States, and that's not in the best interest of the citizens of the United States, which is why we have civilians who are removed from the war machine, who are outside of the war machine and could have a sober, objective, rational analysis of U.S. foreign policy, of what's actually going on. And they can say, I don't care that General Michael Flynn, I don't care that General Petraeus is saying we need to stay in Iraq. I seen the death toll. I seen how corrupt it was to go in there to begin with. I seen how we destroyed the country and destabilized the government, and they still haven't recovered. So I don't give a fuck what excuse. I've also seen how much money we spent on this war, $7 trillion in Iraq. I don't care what excuse the generals are going to make. I don't care if they want to tell me there are 200 ISIS fighters in Iraq. I don't care. We need to leave now. That's what a civilian controlling the military does. But David, they're experts, man. They've been in the field. Hillary Clinton, she's an expert. She was Secretary of State. She was in the field of foreign policy, one of the main players in the field of foreign policy. She is dead wrong on everything. So just because she was Secretary of State, you think it would be a good idea to have Bernie Sanders nominate her to be his Secretary of State? Because, he doesn't know everything, and technically Hillary Clinton wouldn't be an expert because she was Secretary of State. She's worked in the field of foreign policy. Like, that is such a dumb logic. That is stupid logic. And beyond that, you can use that excuse for anything. You can use that rationalization for anything. Why are anybody criticizing politicians? They don't know. A regular person doesn't know how politics works. They don't know the machinations of Congress. They don't know exactly how bills get through and how they're voted on and exactly how much numbers you need to advance it out of committee. People don't know that. So how dare you criticize Nancy Pelosi for being a corporate shill and selling out the Democrats and not supporting Medicare for all and not supporting $15 minimum wage and all these other and being against all these other left-wing priorities? How dare you criticize Nancy Pelosi? She's an expert. So she, by default, knows more about politics than you. You can make that, you can use that rationalization for anything. David, why are you criticizing Donald Trump about how he runs the White House? You don't know anything about running the White House. Donald Trump's been president for 3 years. So he's an expert. If you want to follow your rationalization, or you want to follow your reasoning to its logical conclusion, you should not be criticizing Donald Trump. You don't have the expertise, you don't have the experience to know more about running the White House than Donald Trump because you've never been president of the United States. So why are you criticizing them? Why do you think you know more about running the White House than Donald Trump? That is stupid logic. And it's even dumber when it comes to the generals, because we all know what they've been doing for the last however many decades, going back to Vietnam and the Korean War and before that. After David did his had that terrible response, I was going to respond to that, and I was trying to explain to him, because he also tried to straw man me and pretend as if, like I said, like pretending like I think that I know everything about foreign policy. That's not what I'm saying, and I'm not saying Bernie Sanders thinks he knows everything about foreign policy either. But what I'm saying is this: if Bernie Sanders gets into the White House, he's not asking the generals, he's not asking the Pentagon, he's not asking the national security apparatus, hey, what do you guys think about getting out of Iraq? He's not asking the question, because the answer is going to be the same as it's been for the last 16 years. Or when we're getting out of, what do you guys think about getting out of Afghanistan? The answer is going to be the same as it's been for the last 18 years. We're not going to get out. There are these threats, and we have this problem, and there's going to be a power vacuum, and this and that. So we have to stay there. Indefinite war. That's what the generals have been arguing this entire time. Indefinite war. We can't leave Afghanistan. We can't leave Iraq. We can't leave Syria, because it's going to get worse when we leave. So we indefinitely occupy these places. Bernie Sanders is not asking them when we think we should leave, because that's going to be their answer. Bernie Sanders, when he comes into the White House, he's going to tell the generals, he's going to tell them, come up with a plan to withdraw all U.S. forces out of Iraq, out of Afghanistan, out of Syria, and give me a time frame, give me exactly the logistics of how it's going to be done, and I will follow your logistical advice on how to do it. But I'm not asking you if we should do it. And that's the distinction I'm trying to make. You don't listen to the generals when it comes to should we go to war or should we end the war, because their answer is always going to be the same. Yes, do the war. Yes, stay in the war. You don't ask them about that. You ask them about logistics. And that's the point I was trying to make to David before he strawman the shit out of me. And yes, he did hang up on me. I'm convinced of it. If you watch the video, you look at his arm, and right before the phone conveniently cuts off, you see his arm move, and he's like, hello? And I've seen David do this shit before. I don't take it personally. It's whatever. But the shit that he said in this interaction was egregious. It was bad.